Welcome to Postwave. You're here with Eric and Trevor. Today we're talking about Sam Harris, who's a neuroscientist and author and philosopher who focuses on a bunch of different domains. But the thing he's maybe best known for now is his podcast, Making Sense, where he brings various guests on to discuss topics in philosophy and like current events and politics. Just a quick disclaimer that we're two musicians and composers who like to talk about a bunch of topics that are sometimes slightly beyond our wheelhouse. If we say anything that's factually incorrect, or even if you just disagree with us, we really love if you send us an email at postwavepodcast@gmail.com and let us know. So today we're going to get into one of his main ideas, which is his idea of the moral landscape, which is based on his claim that morality can be determined based on scientific facts.
Cool. So can you tell us what is that argument then?
So we kind of have to go back to David Hume, who's this Scottish philosopher from the 18th century, and the thing that Hume is known best for, maybe, or one of his main contributions, is this idea of the is-ought distinction, which has been super influential ever since it was brought forth. And the idea is basically that you can't get to moral claims or statements about how the world ought to be from scientific fact, from just statements about the way the world is. Yeah, at some point you have to smuggle in some kind of assumption or values or something.
Okay, so I guess, yeah, how does he come to that conclusion?
So basically, I mean, let me see if I can find. So this is from his book, A Treatise on Human Nature, which is from 1739. So he says, in every system of morality which I have hitherto met with, I have always remarked that the author proceeds for some time in the ordinary ways of reasoning, and establishes the being of a god, or makes observations concerning human affairs, when all of a sudden I am surprised to find that instead of the usual copulations of propositions, is and is not, I meet with no proposition that is not connected with an ought, or an ought not. This change is imperceptible, but is, however, of the last consequence. For as this ought or ought not expresses some new relation or affirmation, it is necessary that it should be observed and explained, and at the same time that a reason should be given, for what seems altogether inconceivable, how this new relation can be a deduction from others, which are entirely different from it.
So is he kind of saying that you can't go from saying this is the way things are to this is the way you ought to be because of it?
Right.
Without making an assumption.
Right. And it's not it doesn't apply to things like if you don't want to die, you should not drink the poison. Like it's specifically about moral claims, like
so,
what's best for society or what's
okay. So the difference being that there's the presupposition of a particular goal. That if you have a particular goal in mind, it makes sense to think in terms of what you ought and oughtn't to do to get to that outcome. But if you have a broad societal landscape, you can't assume any particular goal because the goals of the individuals are going to be so widely varied.
Yeah, and those depend on culture and a bunch of assumptions that you're bringing in.
Yeah, makes sense to me.
Yeah. So and this is, I think, something that's way more accepted than not within philosophy, this idea of the is-ought distinction. So Sam Harris's whole argument is that distinction doesn't hold because at the root of any kind of moral claim is the fact that we're all conscious beings that either experience pleasure or pain, and that's kind of an incontrovertible basis for any kind of morality, like consciousness and the experience of conscious beings.
So his stance is that since society is made up of individuals who can feel pleasure and pain, the moral stance is to make decisions on other people's behalf to optimize their pleasure and reduce their pain.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, so what do you mean by act on other people's behalf?
Well, isn't that embedded in saying we ought to do this as a society? Because the core of the is-ought distinction by Hume is that each individual has their own goals, and so to have any blanket assumption about what we ought to do is illogical. And Sam Harris is saying, no, you can have blanket assumptions about people. Now, any blanket assumption is going to include making decisions on behalf of other people.
Right. Yeah, that might be part of it. I think I don't know if Hume was concerned so much like individuals versus the collective. I think where he thought the basis for morality was in the emotions,
How do you mean?
which well, that they're what motivate us to come up with certain moral systems, like our like emotions like disgust or anger
Mm.
or sadness that we feel.
That those are the motivations for any moral system for society that we might devise?
Yeah, I think so.
And Harris is disagreeing by saying that no, you can have a logical, science-based impulse toward the same end.
Yeah. So I'm curious, what do you think about? So we both watched this TED talk that he gave on his idea of the moral landscape, which maybe we'll get into more of the specifics of the idea in a bit. But like, what did you think of it?
It
At
was
first blush.
it was very stirring, and he definitely makes some very provocative points that I think bear exploration, especially as he gets into the specifics that we'll get to later. There's really a very emotional edge to what he's saying, because on a certain level it's like talking about these grand abstract notions, but then to see how that really pertains to a human life.
Yeah, and it is interesting because this whole idea of an is-ought distinction is kind of abstract, but in the things he talks about specifically with religion, it's such a visceral dilemma.
Now, before we jump right into that, I want to back up a second and explore this is-ought distinction concept a little more, because to me, from this exposure that I've just had of it a few minutes ago, I'm still on Hume's side.
Yeah,
I think that he's got a fair point that you can't really make any logical claims toward how other people should live.
yeah. And there's a good conversation that between Sean Carroll and Sam Harris that we can link to, where Sean Carroll's pushing back a lot, and basically I think what it comes down to for him is that he says, both science and morality are based on certain base assumptions, but those two things, the two sets of base assumptions, aren't the same, or they don't overlap. So like, sure, you can base your morality on this base assumption that the well-being of conscious beings is the most important thing and kind of the guiding light, but you have to acknowledge that it's a base assumption and not just like a given from scientific fact.
Yeah. I want to run a hypothetical situation by you. This is entirely playing the devil's advocate. But so All right, so take this hypothetical scenario. You have a gimp who loves to feel pain and torture and misery. That's how he derives the greatest satisfaction. Now, if you have a moral stance that you should reduce suffering in other people, and you want to apply this blanket stance across the board, and so maybe you enact a policy that says no more gimps, no consent is not a viable grounds for having this kind of experience. Wouldn't that be sanctioned under Harris's approach?
You're not the first person to think of that kind of thought experiment. And so I mean, so this whole moral landscape idea is kind of a flavor of utilitarianism in general.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, and I'm blanking on how exactly utilitarians deal with that kind of thing. So deontology is the idea that you should never do certain things. Like, it's wrong to kill people. It's the whole idea of in the trolley problem.
Right.
Deontology is hitting the 5 people because you shouldn't kill someone under any circumstances.
Mm.
And utilitarianism is you should kill the one person even though you're killing someone because it'll save those 5 people. So in your experiment, if you were thinking deontologically, you would say, yeah, you should never, like, people should never undergo harm.
Mm.
But if you're looking at it from a utilitarian point of view, then if that person undergoing quote unquote harm is what's going to get them off, then it's okay because the result is increased satisfaction or well-being.
Mm.
But the problem there, it's like, how do you define well-being? It's not such a clear thing.
Yeah, right. That's really the hard part, because that state of well-being could be so many highly variant states of living for so many different people.
Yeah, and one thing about Sam Harris in general, I think, is that he makes what seem like very simple, direct, common sense arguments, and it's tempting to just go right along with them.
Mm-hmm.
Because he has such like a persuasive way of speaking, and
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes I think he's on the right track, but
Sure.
I do think, yeah, it's more complicated.
Right. Yeah, he has a very compelling way of speaking and presents information as if it's very straightforward, but there's often hidden layers, meaning that he might not come to ultimately the right conclusion or what other people might think is right, but it really shows to me that it's important and especially valuable to consider all of his ideas.
Yeah, I think he definitely has like a positive net effect on society and the discourse or whatever.
It would seem that way to me as well.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's equally as important to not take everything or anything he says for granted.
Yeah, so maybe this would be a good time to talk about kind of how I got into him and
Yeah, please.
and all that. So yeah, he was actually my door into the whole podcasting world pretty much. Like, I mean, before him, I think I listened to like this one astronomy podcast and that was it. But I hadn't really gotten to the whole like long form conversation kind of science and philosophy and politics world of podcasting. And it was literally like a Facebook ad, I'm pretty sure. It's like, oh, something that I'd like seen go by a couple of times with like, oh, like 4 of your friends like Sam Harris. And it always seemed kind of edgy to me. I wasn't sure if it was like something I should be getting myself into or not. And I think I remember I like listened to a few episodes, then I went back to the very first episode he did, which I think I sent you part of, and it was called "Drugs and the Meaning of Life."
Hmm.
I was like, oh, what's that about? And I think this was like maybe like a year or so after the first time I had done acid, and somehow I'd never really heard someone talk about psychedelics in the way he did, even
Hmm.
though there's a pretty as we know there are lots of people who talk about them that way, like Alan Watson, Terence McKenna, and Ram Dass, and but I had never really I'd never really been exposed to that before, and I think as we've talked about a little bit, I very much saw my first acid trip in kind of a spiritual religious light. Like I had I'd been fairly sure for the past the few years before that religion was just totally wrong about everything, and
Hmm.
not really worth anyone's time, and I don't know about not worth anyone's time. Um, that like I didn't know I wasn't going to be a Christian or whatever.
Hmm.
Um, and that whole acid experience made me way less sure that I knew what was actually going on.
Hmm.
And I saw it in kind of that quasi religious light, even though it wasn't like a conversion experience or anything. But he kind of gave me the kind of more rational context for that, while at the same time being spiritual.
Hmm.
So I was kind of hooked after that, I think. And again, it was this whole world I hadn't really got into before. And yeah, I mean, through him, I found Very Bad Wizards and um, probably Sean Carroll and a bunch of other people who I'm really interested in now. So
Now you're down the rabbit hole.
yeah.
Who's the Mad Hatter in this analogy? Alex Jones?
Probably Joe Rogan.
Yeah. Change places.
Oh, and I guess one more thing on that note. I mean, he was also the one who got me interested in meditation, along with the whole psychedelics thing. I think one of the things he has said that like is that if psychedelics are like strapping yourself to a rocket, then meditation is like being on a sailboat,
Yeah.
and you can get to the same places eventually, but it's a little more uh, dependable.
Well, Trevor,
as to
I'm
far.
pretty sure you can't get to the moon in a sailboat.
Okay, well, pretend it's pretend it's a suborbital rocket.
Okay.
Like you can end up.
You gotta be specific with your metaphors here, Trevor.
Yeah, I didn't make up the metaphor.
Hmm. Yeah, no, that's. So how long have you been doing meditating then?
I've honestly been pretty like inconsistent about it lately. I mean, there was a time, I guess it was like 2018, because I only really started doing it after I had a really like nasty breakup in early 2018,
Hmm.
and was just kind of trying to get my shit together. And I did it pretty much every day for like a good few months or so. I mean, now I don't really do it like formally that often, but I feel like I've been pretty good about kind of integrating mindfulness into my day.
Hmm.
Like especially when I'm on walks and stuff, I try to be very mindful and conscious of just the way things sound, or just the way walking feels.
Hmm. Now, when you say you try to be mindful, is that just a figure of speech, or are you doing it wrong?
Well, I mean, the idea is for it for it to seem effortless, but I mean, it depends what you mean by the word try. I mean, uh you shouldn't be like scolding yourself for getting distracted or anything like that.
Hmm. Well, it just
But
makes me think about Alan Watts. He has this little thing he says, which he, I think, took directly from some Eastern philosophy, where there's this little story where there's the student who's studying under the enlightened monk to become enlightened. And first they say, okay, look, you don't desire things, and work on not desiring things, and the student goes really and practices and does it really well and says, look, I don't desire this anymore, I don't desire that. And then the teacher says, okay, good, but isn't by trying to not desire things, isn't that you desiring to not desire?
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's a very, very Zen way of looking at it. Yeah. So I mean, you can get kind of like loopy and esoteric like that, but I mean, meditation is basically sharpening your attention, or like flexing the muscle of your attention. So it takes conscious effort to do it. At least while you're starting, and for a long time after. I mean, yeah, the goal is to kind of have this feeling of effortless awareness, but yeah, you can't really get there without some kind of effort. Yeah, I mean, actually, so when I do meditate, I use Sam Harris's app, and pretty much at the end of every like 10-minute meditation, the last minute is just let your mind be completely open and don't expend any effort at all.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like it could be a very valuable practice. I personally have never really delved into conscious meditation, but like you're saying, I feel like I've, at least at times, managed to integrate a degree of reflection into my daily life that could be the same as the desired outcome of meditation.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a tricky thing, because I think a lot of the reason I find myself not doing it now is because I feel pretty mentally stable, and like I'm on solid ground. But kind of the thing is, for it to help you, you need to do it all the time, and then it'll be there to kind of catch you when you need it.
It seems to me that the value that it creates is the space, right? It's the space in which reflection happens. That is, it's the landscape, the possibility of perceiving, of being aware of your existence, of the world. And every time you make space for that awareness, the awareness will flood in.
And part of the mindfulness practice and meditation is at the same time you're making an effort to concentrate, you're trying to notice that consciousness itself is appearing, or things are appearing in consciousness without effort.
Yeah.
Like you don't have to try to be aware of things. They just are in your awareness.
Yeah, totally. And maybe in the same sense, to meditate is less about trying to like put in the effort to shape the space, but rather allowing that space to exist, and simply if you let it happen, it will.
Yeah, and I guess I mean we should be a little bit more specific, because there's lots of different kinds of meditation. So mindfulness is the one people are probably most familiar with. There's also this version called metta, or loving kindness meditation, which is where you picture someone, and you start with someone who you really love, and you just, the thing that you meditate on is, I wish this person well, I wish them happiness. You just try to focus on that feeling of wishing this person well, and then you progress to someone who is kind of neutral, and then eventually you progress to someone who you have like kind of bad feelings for, or have a really troubled relationship with. Which I find to be really difficult.
I wish this motherfucker happiness.
Yeah, I mean, it's not like the wishing happiness that's the hard part. It's just, I think I start thinking about like all the awful shit that like has been involved. So there's that, and then there's also the kind of meditation that Sam Harris I think promotes the most, which is this tradition of Dzogchen, which is explicitly focused on recognizing the non-duality of consciousness.
The non-duality of consciousness. What does that mean?
Yeah, so this is definitely one of the main places that meditation intersects with psychedelics, because you can achieve the same kind of ego death state that you would get on psychedelics with intensive meditation practice.
How does the term
Yeah.
non-duality relate to ego death?
So non-duality refers to this kind of subject-object distinction,
Hmm.
right? Like I'm in here, and there's objects out there that I can see,
Mm-hmm.
and so it's dual, right? There's two things that are there,
Yeah.
and part of the idea of this practice is to notice that there's no observer, like there's no seat from which you're seeing things, like you're not behind your eyes seeing things, they just like are appearing.
Hmm.
If that makes sense. And the one of the analogies that I found to be most helpful, and actually when I have been meditating recently, I've been going through this course on the app, but it's about this idea of having no head,
Hmm.
which was this concept that this guy Douglas Harding came up with sometime in the 20th century. I'm not gonna remember the exact year, but it's this idea that the feeling of ego death or non-duality is analogous to realizing that you can't see your own head. It without a mirror or anything. When you just observe your body, you see you see your legs, you see your torso, and where your torso terminates, there's just like the world.
Hmm.
And if you can focus on that feeling, it's kind of analogous to what ego death or the loss of the sense of self feels like.
I remember when I was a freshman in college having this kind of zen-like moment amid the stress of everything. And it was while I was in band, like the concert band, and there's all these music majors around me with their instruments and their tense directionality in life. They had all these, it seemed to me, all these performance majors with their very narrow particular practice that they were devoting everything around. And I had this visceral imagery of all of them as sort of a projection of their form, but it was kind of like a subjective shell. It was like if you were to look at them head on, you would see a whole person, but if you went around to the side, you would see they were just like that part of them that is facing forward. And the place where they are rooted is nothingness.
Wow.
Which seems really, really judgmental, I know, but of course it extended to myself as well.
Wow. The place they're rooted is nothingness, meaning like their whole life is a lie, or like
Oh no, just that their meaning that they derive from life is entirely relevant only to a particular trajectory through life. And if they are examined from any other perspective, the meaning is proven to be irrelevant, or it doesn't hold up except for from that one perspective.
yeah, I mean, like, if they were gonna switch to another major, then all the classes and everything would basically be like they just have to start over because their experience thus far wouldn't really apply.
Mm-hmm.
Is that kind of what you mean?
I mean that. I guess that is one aspect of it. Although, of course, I think this stands true for anyone in any major. I think a lot of people approach life this way, where they're sort of falling forward, and the only way that their life has meaning, so it would seem to themselves, is by reaching toward a particular goal in the future.
Yeah, yeah, it's kind of the the carrot and stick thing where you're what you want is always slightly out of reach, and you're always just kind of striving towards that.
Totally. Yeah, it's that same feeling of like inevitable treadmill.
Yeah, yeah. If you're enjoying what you're listening to so far and you want to support us somehow, there's lots of ways you can do that. You can go follow us on Facebook or Instagram, or visit us online at postwavepodcast.com, or send us a nice email at postwavepodcast@gmail.com. You can also follow us on your podcasting platform of choice. We're on pretty much everyone out there. Give us a nice review if you're on a platform that supports that, or a 5-star rating. Thanks for listening. So yeah, I think to kind of wrap up this whole meditation psychedelics thing, I think this is really what sets them apart from the rest of the intellectual dark web guys, which I think, as I mentioned in our intellectual dark web episode, he's very much on the fringes of that group and doesn't really consider himself a member of it, especially not anymore. But no one else in that group really has this connection with meditation, and I guess spiritual philosophy is what you'd call it. No one else really has that kind of bent.
And you'd say that that is a significant difference, a very meaningful distinction.
I think so, yeah. Not that they're not into philosophy, but it's particularly with regards to spirituality, I feel like no one else really has that much of an interest in it.
They're not woke like he is.
I think they're all pretty anti woke. Which is good segue to get into kind of a bunch of the more controversial shit he said.
Yeah, so let's go back to that TED Talk, because he gets to some very particular areas here.
So kind of the first thing that made him a big name was his first book, The End of Faith. Did you read anything about that?
No.
Like I should have sent you some stuff. But basically he said that he wrote the first chapter kind of like all at once, I think very immediately in the aftermath of 9/11. And he's talked about that as a moment where he realized he was still living in history, which I think is a pretty remarkable idea, because we have this. I think a lot of us have this idea that we're in a Western developed country, like we're stuff like that doesn't happen here. There's never going to be a war on U.S. soil, that kind of thing. And I think he said for him that event kind of shook him out of that assumption.
And so when he says he was living in history, does that mean like because he was in reaction to this monumental change in United States American consciousness, perception of their own safety?
I think he meant more that 9/11 will go down as a gigantic event in U.S. history, and that events like that can still happen and are happening. I think he meant it more in that way.
And then also kind of comparing that, I think, to how rooted in the present we are, that I think there's a a certain degree of presentist chauvinism that we experience, where we think that what we're living through is so unprecedented and remarkable that the future generations will surely remember it. But really, I mean, sure, people will remember some things for a while, but then in the grand scheme of things, they're really, really not that special compared to what future generations may also have to deal with.
Yeah, I mean that's a good point. I mean, now that we're thinking about World War II, I mean, the only thing that comes, I think, even close to 9/11 is Pearl Harbor, right?
Sure.
Yeah.
There's that Rick and Morty scene where they're bombing like
Oh, where it's like, is that where it's like the Purge and they're, or it's a different.
No, it's in the season 4, I think, and there's like the parasitic creatures that look like balls that go on your face, and they have like a society, and then Rick and Morty break out of the society and decide as like a fuck you, they're going to bomb all these innocent civilians, and then there's like the Twin Towers, and they're looking at it and they're like, no, we're not going to go there. And then they go past that, and then there's like a harbor with like ships moored there, and they're like, that on the other hand.
I forgot about that. I feel like that's maybe the first Rick and Morty reference we've made on this entire podcast, which is
Oh no, we've definitely had some before.
Really?
At least 2. Yeah. Or in the early days.
Yeah. Anyway, so yeah, in the aftermath of that, he wrote this book, The End of Faith, which was aimed at all religions pretty much, specifically Christianity and Islam, I think. And he was kind of part of this other informal group called the Four Horsemen of the Atheist Apocalypse, or the
that's not dramatic at all.
4 atheist horsemen. I don't know if the word apocalypse was actually in there, but so it was like him and Richard Dawkins and Dan Dennett, who's another philosopher, and then Christopher Hitchens. And so the 4 of them were pretty prominent in the culture for being really, really strongly against all religions, just kind of based on the fact that they're not based on scientific fact, but they're based on really texts that were written thousands of years ago. And that I mean, one of Sam Harris's arguments is that literally anyone alive today knows far more about the way the world works than anyone who wrote the Bible or the Quran or anything like that. Like there's no comparison between just a normal person today and the people who wrote those books in terms of knowledge about how the world works. And of course you could argue that it's not really relevant to the morality that's contained in religious texts, but he does kind of have a point, I think.
I think this is an important moment to recognize that there are so many different ways to interpret these texts. Let's take, for example, the Bible, which you may take as a history, an imperfect history, but a history nonetheless. Or you could take it literally, or literally infinite interpretations in between. And I think there's a lot of people who derive real meaning by examining these texts and these philosophies in the texts, and creating ways of life with that as an inspiration. Now, I personally, from my own experience, having grown up in a Christian church, came to the conclusion that my engaging with this source material was actually detrimental to my own progression after a certain point. And that is what ultimately led me away from that and through atheism. So I guess I'll just start there and say that I see in my own personal experience how religion can be a negative aspect. And I've also seen in other people interpretations that have been wildly valuable to that person's identity.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. And I personally, like, I don't go around telling people that, oh, you shouldn't believe in God, or, follow religion because it's detrimental. Like, it's whatever people get out of it, and if it's a net positive for people, then it's a net positive. And I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with that. It does kind of get back to how Sam Harris and a lot of these kind of new atheist is the other term that people use to describe them. A lot of these new atheist guys make these very direct and arguments that they present as being very obvious and kind of incontrovertible, but it's more complicated than that.
Definitely. Now, so he's talking in his TED Talk about specifically Islam and the kinds of things that are believed not only by fringe groups, but by a majority of Muslim people.
Right. And I think right away we run into the problem of, like, which groups of Muslims are we talking about? Because we should say first off, right off the bat, like, there are plenty of Muslims who are practicing their religion and not harming anyone, and practicing in a very positive way, and all over the world. But there is a difference between Muslim populations in the U.S. and Muslim populations in countries that are majority Muslim, and the way those practices kind of play out over there, that I think makes this whole issue a lot harder and more complicated to talk about, because well, I mean, myself included, people don't have a lot of direct experience with people in these majority Muslim countries, or even with Muslims in their own country. I mean, I know at least, I know at least one person who's Muslim. I don't know if I can think of another one right now.
Not
it's
a
pretty
wide pool to draw from.
Yeah.
So in his talk, Harris is delineating so there's different groups of Muslims. So he says at the center you have jihadists. These are the extremists, violent people who wake up and they want to kill apostates.
Yeah, apostates being people who left the faith.
Correct. And outside of them you have Islamists. These are people who are just as convinced in martyrdom and paradise, he says.
And isn't part of the distinction with Islamists that they want to establish a government that's based on Islamic principles?
Yeah, totally. So they want Islam to be everywhere, but they're not going to go blow up trains to do it. They want to work within the system, Harris says, to change government policy to have Islam be at the core of everything.
Mm-hmm.
And so the combination of the extremists plus the larger percentage of the Islamists represents 20% of the population.
Mm-hmm. And then the rest is more moderate.
So then he goes on and says that even in the UK, 78% of Muslims believed that a Danish cartoonist who did a depiction of Muhammad should have been prosecuted. So there's still quite a majority who believe in sort of extreme
ideologies.
Yeah, exactly. And so outside of that, there's a vast majority who are conservative Muslims, and these people hold views about feminism and homosexuality that we in the West would consider immoral, and we might even have a very strong emotional reaction to, were we to see the same kinds of stances, the same kinds of prejudices and misogyny in our own culture. And in fact, we do often get way up in arms when we see even a small amount of those things. And so his main question is, why don't we get up in arms about it when we see this much more severe systemized misogyny and bias in a different culture?
Yeah, I think the reason for that is our knowledge of the legacy of colonialism,
Mm.
and that we don't want to feel like we're imposing Western values onto these countries that have already been so messed up by European powers. One of the more famous examples, I think, was after World War II, when the European countries were dividing up the Middle East, they did it in a very kind of haphazard way, and just kind of drew some lines randomly, not randomly, but not with any regards to the actual populations that were there. And you can very plausibly argue that a lot of the strife that's going on there now is because those European countries didn't know what they were doing and messed things up permanently, more or less. Not permanently, but messed them up in a way that is very hard to correct.
Mm. Yeah, certainly. That seems like a really important thing to be aware of. Now, I think that Harris goes on and makes a pretty compelling case for that sort of extreme caution is not warranted in this case, because if you look at the actual living conditions of people, for example, women in these Muslim majority communities, how would you describe it?
I mean, okay, so the one most people are familiar with probably is the hijab, right? Which has kind of become an icon of tolerance and the coexistence of feminism and Islam and that kind of thing, which just covers the head and the neck. There are a bunch of other different forms of coverings which cover more and more of the body. The extreme being the burqa that doesn't show pretty much anything, right?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at it, you can't even really see someone's eyes in them.
Right. So there's that aspect to it.
Yeah, and that people are feeling that they need to wear this. Or the most charitable interpretation that I've heard or argument, and this is from Sam Harris's interview with Yasmin Mohammed, who speaks of her own experience being raised in a conservative Muslim household. Well, she brings up that wearing these things is incredibly dehumanizing. Was incredibly dehumanizing for her, and that maybe the most charitable argument for wearing this, if you talk to women who choose to wear these, they will say generally that they feel safe doing so, because if they don't, then they could be raped by a man. And isn't that kind of a horrible situation to be in, of having to cover yourself up entirely in this big, unappealing covering in 120-degree weather so that someone doesn't rape you?
Yeah, totally. And this gets to what I think is one of the main conflicts here, because we have it drilled into our heads, rightly so, in the West growing up, when we did that, you don't speak for other people, you don't tell other people what to think about their experience. You can only let people speak for themselves, and especially as a white man, you shouldn't presuppose what people are experiencing or what they think or what they want. So it is kind of hard to get at what these women like what would be best for them, and it's hard not to feel or seem paternalistic or kind of superior. I'm not saying I feel superior, but
No, of course.
I yet right, but I worry that I think the natural worry is that you're coming off as
intolerant.
Yeah, or thinking that you so obviously know better than this whole culture that's been around for hundreds of years. And this does kind of get back to the moral landscape idea.
Yeah, it does.
right?
Yeah, because here we are saying, hey, look, maybe we can say this isn't quite right. Maybe even though it's us looking externally at someone else's experience, we're kind of making a case that maybe that is a reasonable thing to do in this situation.
Mm-hmm.
Because in his interview with Yasmin Mohammed, he brings up this point where there's a raid on the household of a Mormon leader in the U.S. where they found all these underage girls in, traditional conservative outfits and like forced to wear these particular kinds of clothings, and like several girls per old man who's the age of their grandfather, and they all these people are the men are arrested and stuff, and the women are liberated, and but in that situation, of course, all these women are saying, no, I love my husband, I want to serve him, I want to do everything for him. But in that situation, we didn't take their word at face value. We kind of said, look, no, we know better than you.
Yeah, yeah, and in that situation, I think Sam Harris even used the word brainwashed, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or one of them used the word brainwashed. That that's essentially what they were. They had been kind of indoctrinated to accept something as normal that wasn't
Mm-hmm.
normal.
And isn't that kind of the core of what any culture is, right? It's a set of core beliefs that we kind of hold to just because that's the way it is.
Yeah, yeah. It's programming that's kind of, it can be changed, but it's very hard to change it. The more committed you are to kind of getting along with society, the harder it is to change any of that.
And so would you say this is where Harris's statement that science objectivity lends a valuable approach to morality?
Yeah. Although, again, it all kind of hinges on how we define this idea of well-being.
Hmm.
Yeah, kind of like you were saying, it has to be decided on the individual level in the end,
Hmm.
right? So, and how else are you gonna figure out what it is on an individual level other than asking people directly?
Yeah, certainly. It really feels like an intractable problem to me, because that's like such an apt point that leads to the conclusion that live and let live. Any other culture we can't really judge, but at the same time, like, there's as strong a case that we can know some situations lead to experiences that aren't good and that don't give you the freedom or the ability to address that, and that by making decisions on behalf of someone else, maybe you really are doing a good thing overall.
So this kind of gets to Harris's idea of seeing all religions as just collections of ideas, right?
Mm.
And and being able to say no matter what the religion is, and no matter what it might seem like the right thing to do is, kind of from a political standpoint, to just critique bad ideas over good ideas.
Yeah, and there's again, like, so many different ways you can interpret any set of beliefs. Like, for example, you have fundamentalist Christians who read Leviticus and say, well, we should kill the gays and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have Christians who don't take such a literal approach to the Bible and who come to very humanitarian stances,
Mm-hmm.
despite those words still being in the Bible.
Yeah. So I think what Sam Harris and the New Atheists would say, or try to point out, is look, the like, you have the Bible or these religious texts as they are, right? And science is, and current thinking is only ever taking you further away from those, right? Like the Bible isn't pulling you back from, like, it has nothing to contribute in addition to these new philosophies or scientific findings.
Mm.
Like it's always kind of science and new ways of thinking replacing ideas that were in the Bible or invalidating them. It's unless you're like a complete fundamentalist and you believe everything that's in there. Um, it usually doesn't go the other way, right?
So send the fundamentalists to Ezekiel 8.
What's Ezekiel 8?
That's the one where there's like a dad and his two daughters in a cave, and the dad doesn't want to have sex with his daughters, and they're like, oh no, but what are we gonna do? There's no one else here. So they get him really drunk and have sex with him, like rape him basically. And then he has kids, and then they like lie to him about it.
Wow, I hadn't heard of that one before. Yikes. I mean, it also kind of relates to the idea of God in the gaps. Like God,
Right.
religion and God explains everything that science can't explain.
Mm-hmm.
Or, to go back to the kind of is-ought distinction, like, religion and philosophy explain moral things and science explains factual things, and there can't really be a direct connection between the two.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that is why ultimately I was led myself away from Christianity, because it seemed to me that having a religion pursuing knowledge and awareness of the world, forming an understanding of how things are, and sure, you can derive inspiration from these texts. However, to me, it started to feel like what it had to offer was paltry in comparison to what science had to offer and pure philosophy. So it led me to the conclusion that, sure, okay, maybe some of the stuff in this book is true, but in order to see objectively if it is true or not, I need to be able to walk away from it. And if it is true, it'll come back. But if it's not, then I will continue to learn in the places where it's relevant.
Yeah, I think that's really good mindset. Yeah, as much as I want to stay away from religion bashing, I do think, I mean, so I, my mom's is like an ordained minister, and I've been around the church a lot, and one thing that gets talked about a lot is the various translations of certain words, like what was the original Greek in the Bible, and what was it, what does that word mean? What are the bunch of different interpretations and all that stuff? And I find it really interesting, like without a doubt. I think it's really interesting to think about like what the original intent was when it was written, and like who was it written by. I think all that stuff is really interesting from like a literature perspective.
Mm-hmm.
But as far as that being the thing that you're trying to derive all your meaning and like life philosophy from, it just seems like it's doing the work in all the wrong places, like spending so much time trying to figure out very, very specific and kind of granular things about this text that was written thousands of years ago.
Yeah, I've gotten the impression from religious friends who take it very seriously, and from discussions that I've had, that trying to justify like a meaningful view, a robust understanding of life through the lens of Christianity, as the example that I've had experience with, just felt like jumping through hoops and bending over backwards to try to make these things fit together that really don't seem to fit together especially well from my perspective. And the only thing I could think of, though, is for some of these people, it is that very bending over backwards, the exerting oneself to try to make it work, that grounds them and makes it so that they can approach an understanding.
Mm-hmm. You mean the people who do find religion useful find or some people who find religion useful find it the very act of bending it to fit like modern life. They find that meaningful in its own right.
Yeah, because it's such a rigorous and challenging exercise,
Mm-hmm.
right? And
Yeah.
so to go through that exercise, I mean, it flexes some muscles for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, for me, I mean, as far as religion goes, like I have no problem at all with the, of course, I have no problem with all, with the love your naiber as yourself, that kind of
Well, I
thing.
think it's important.
Help the poor and all that stuff. I think, I mean, the thing that that I have more of a problem with is all the metaphysical. There was a creator of the universe, and this is where you go when you die, and all that stuff.
The assertions of knowledge without any evidence to back it up.
Yeah, and of course, a lot of contemporary, progressive Christians don't, they've abstracted those concepts to be very, very metaphorical, and and to kind of consider the whole thing just as like a holy mystery. Which I think is a pretty good way to look at it, because really no one knows.
Yeah, for sure.
I guess one thing I want to add. I mean, we're talking a lot about Sam Harris specifically, but so yeah, I mean, yeah, Sam Harris is not working in a vacuum, just kind of spouting off on Islam without talking to any people who aren't actually Muslim or were Muslim. One of the people he's worked the closest with is this guy Majid Nawaz, who he wrote this book with. Called, I believe, Islam and the Future of Tolerance, and it's kind of a dialogue. It's written in the form of a dialogue between them, and Majid Nawaz is he's still Muslim, but he's one of the people trying to reform the faith from the inside, which is ultimately, I mean, the only way that any change is going to happen. So I give Sam Harris credit for that, for not just spouting off in a vacuum about all this stuff without talking to the people who are affected.
Yeah.
And kind of like we talked about in our IDW episode, our political climate right now places very different, or has a very different view of certain ideas depending on who's saying them. Especially when the person saying them is a white man, they tend to be a lot more skeptical, even if you can find people who are of the identities that are most directly concerned saying the same exact things. So
I mean, yeah, totally. And I think there's probably maybe a good reason, at least in part, for some of that.
I mean, I think it's totally justified. Yeah, I mean, I think it's justified, but it's but I think it can kind of skew things. Don't you think?
Yeah, it can. And I was when I first heard Harris's talk on the subject, I was very cautious about taking what he said as speaking from a knowledgeable perspective. And it wasn't really until I heard his interview with Yasmin Muhammad, who talks. There's a really touching moment in that talk where she tears up and starts to cry and says that she was so moved by Harris's TED Talk, where he brings up this issue because it seemed to her that he truly felt that these women, these girls who are subjugated in these really awful ways in a large section of Muslim culture, that he saw them as people, and that in the West, our over reluctance to be critical of other cultures has led us to a perspective where we kind of create a barrier between us and them, us and those other people who are suffering over there, because who are we to judge, you know?
Yeah, it was really touching.